born out of an international financial disaster. This small, second-hand, underfunded F1 team rose well above its weight to not just punch down on the big players, but to beat them well and truly. This is the Hollywood-esque story of Brawn GP. Before we can talk about Ross Brawn's team, we gotta talk about Ken Tyrrell's team, Tyrrell. They had been competing in F1 since 1958, and they were pretty darn good, winning the manufacturer's title and 3 drivers' titles. However, by 1998, all of the performance had gone, and Ken Tyrrell sold his failing team to British American Tobacco. They then formed British American Racing, and they had some mild success. They were a solid mid-tier team. Nothing to shout at, but not bad. Until 2004, when the FIA passed new regulations on tobacco sponsorships and they had to sell the team. And since they were powered by Honda engines, they sold the team to Honda, who renamed it Honda F1. Now you're thinking, Honda? Their fastest car at that point was the NSX, which had just 276 horsepower. How is that gonna be an F1 team? Well, this is not the first time Honda had been in F1. In fact, they were the first Japanese manufacturer in history to win a Grand Prix in the 1965 Mexican GP. And in fact, they finished 4th overall in the championship with John Surtees when his RA300 won the 1967 Italian GP. So they were a very mild, successful F1 team. And as an engine manufacturer, they won 11 championships from 1986 to 1991. They were pretty darn good. Their Honda Racing F1 was not quite as good. In 2006 and 2007, they secured 4th and 8th in the manufacturer's championship, which was not a great start, but it was not terrible. It was solid mid-tier, maybe the equivalent of Haas or Racing Point from 2019, but it was a decent start, all things considered. 2008, well, they were planning for the 2009 regulation changes, so they decided to scrap the 2008 season and use it as development. Under their new management of Ross Brawn. You see, Ross Brawn had helped Michael Schumacher win a bunch of titles with Ferrari until Ferrari's lovely internal politics caused him and a bunch of other people to leave. So, he was now in charge of Honda's F1 team for 2008, developing the RA109. And that development was actually going pretty smoothly. Their aerodynamics were exceptional when it comes to the 2009 season. You see, they didn't care about 2008. They wanted to focus on 2009. They were also developing a curve system. It was a pretty good car. And then it all came to a grinding halt. A global financial meltdown killed any hope of an actual F1 team with Honda, because let's be real, when the global economy is collapsing on itself like a dying star, the last thing you want to do is spend $300 million a year on an F1 team. So they withdrew. And this meant that Ross Brawn, their driver Jensen Button, and Barrichello, didn't have a team or an engine. They had a fantastic chassis, and it was a rolling chassis, but they had a good chassis. So they desperately tried to have a buyout program with the likes of ProDrive and Virgin Group and even more. But nothing was going through. So in a last-ditch effort, Ross Brawn and his chief executive Nick Fry spent some of their own money on Honda F1, bought it for £1, and renamed it Brawn GP. Now, yes, they bought it for £1, but they still had to do all the development, and Honda gave them a bit of assistance in the finance department by using the money they would normally use to shut the program down, and by giving it to them instead. But Brawn was not exactly financially stable. So, while sure their name was changed from Honda Racing F1 to Brawn GP, and their RA109 was rebadged into the BGP 001, they had a bigger problem. They got no engines! So they had to go with a second-hand Mercedes V8 because it was the closest in architecture to their Honda V8. But it still wasn't great. Not only did they have to cut 6 inches off the car just to shoehorn the thing in, they also had to increase the weight. And since they cut 6 inches out of the car with a brand new engine, the balance was totally off, and since they had no money, the curve system was also off. So, with 23 days left before the start of the F1 season, Brawn GP was recognized by the FIA to compete in F1, and heading into the 2009 F1 season, Brawn had an unbalanced, heavier car with a second-hand engine and a budget of about 50 cents. They did have one ace up their sleeve: the double diffuser. You see, the rules stated the diffuser must be aligned to the center of the rear wheels. However, a loophole was written in that allowed for an increase in diffuser volume, provided the additional volume was not visible from the underside of the car. That's an actual rule. You can look it up in the 2009 rulebook. I don't know why they included such an oddly specific caveat in there, but they did. And combined now with the aerodynamics that they worked on in 2008, meant that the cash-strapped rookies on their first event, just 23 days after being founded, headed over to the Australian GP, in which they proceeded to then lock out the front row in qualifying, and then Jenson Button led Brawn GP to a 1-2 finish in their first ever race of their first ever season, becoming the first manufacturer in F1 history to win on their debut since Mercedes' win in 1954. Button then won again in Malaysia, came third in China, and then proceeded to win the next 4 races in a row. Meaning, if you do the maths, Brawn had won 6 out of the first 7 Grand Prix, and both Button and Brawn were leading the championship by an enormous margin. However, just like every rising action bit of a movie, there was a problem. Their lack of money because of their lack of sponsorships. I think they had one sponsor the entire season, which was Bridgestone. Other than that, it was pretty much touch and go. Maybe they'll sponsor me for a season, maybe they'll sponsor me for this race. That was their financial status. And while other teams could spend money developing their cars, Brawn couldn't. In fact, they were so cash-strapped they couldn't even build extra chassis. Barrichello used 2 chassis the entire season, and Button used a singular chassis for the entire season. So they had 3 chassis total, and they prayed to God they didn't crash them or didn't get crashed into. This meant that Red Bull and their lead driver Sebastian Vettel, you might know him in the next few seasons, rapidly began eating away at Brawn and Button's lead in the titles. Now, granted, this didn't mean that Brawn wasn't competitive. I mean, Barrichello led Brawn in their 4th 1-2 finish of the season at the Italian Grand Prix, but Red Bull had the faster car by the end of the season, and Brawn was starting to get fewer and fewer podium finishes. This meant that the championship would go down to the wire in the second-to-last race of the season in Brazil. Barrichello would do quite well, qualifying on pole position before eventually falling down to 8th place over the course of the race, and Button would stay pretty consistent throughout, scoring a 5th place overall. Now, those don't sound impressive. However, those positions, and critically those points, were enough to secure both Brawn and Button the manufacturers and drivers' titles with a race to spare. They were broke again at the end of the season. Brawn had actually had to put some of his own money into his team just to keep it afloat. But don't worry, because Brawn was bailed out by Mercedes, who turned the team into Mercedes-GP, which later became Mercedes-AMG, which, well, you know, they're pretty darn good. They dominated the turbo hybrid era, but that wouldn't have been possible without Brawn in the first place. And here's the interesting bit of irony with this. Since Brawn was formed after the 2008 season and was bought out for the start of the 2010 season, they only competed once. And in that one time, they won both the Drivers' and the Manufacturers' Championship, meaning, statistically speaking, they are the most successful F1 team of all time, having the only team in history to have a 100% championship success rate. And in terms of wins, they are second best of all time, with a 47% Grand Prix win ratio. And as of 2020, Brawn is the last British licensed team to win the F1 championship. All eyes are on you, McLaren. Clock's ticking.